The topic of metal detectors has received increasing amounts of coverage in the last decades as more schools have begun acquiring them. Much controversy has arisen due to the drastic pros and cons relating to the violence prevention program. As stated by Anne Garrett in her book, Keeping American Schools Safe, the use of metal detectors sends a strong message to students in the community that there is a problem with weapons and we are serious about solving it. My opponent claims that metal detectors in schools have severe negative consequences. Her supporting arguments were that 1, school violence is rather rare, 2, metal detectors take away from school education, and 3, metal detectors have bad psychological consequences for students. I feel that her arguments to support her primary claim were either irrelevant, inferential, underdeveloped through a lack of thorough evidence, and were not enough to convince the audience of her view. Everyone, I'm sure, has a good idea about metal detectors, but the specifications were unclear as to what the metal detectors are used for specifically for the school's purpose and what types of metal detectors are being used. She stated that the LA Unified School District and the Inglewood School District had adopted the use of metal detectors, but she didn't mention the motivation for them to use the equipment. One of her sources was an online article named Metal Detectors, Bad Ideas for School, which was a very biased article only focusing on the negative effects of the metal detectors. My opponent's first supporting claim, school violence is rather rare, is completely irrelevant to her main claim of negative consequences. School violence being rather rare would be more suited to support the notion that metal detectors are unnecessary for schools to use. In addition, violence covers a very broad spectrum of violent situations in the school atmosphere. The final report on school violence prevention and response from the state of California in 2000 categorized violence into many different groups: traditional violence such as fistfights, bullying, shoving, etc., vandalism, psychotic violence, gang violence, avenging violence, and other types. The specific type of school violence metal detectors are aimed at preventing are not sharpening up the bathroom stalls or kicking shins on the playground, but a more severe violence. Secondly, even if school violence is rare and it still occurs, it can occur on large levels such as Columbine or the Virginia Tech shootings. Even if they are rare occurrences, does that mean that police and school officials shouldn't take more drastic precautions to prevent violence by increasing safety? Many times kids will have guns and other weapons on them, but they don't use them. Metal detectors can prevent situations that was not brought up in her speech. Her second supporting claim that metal detectors take away from education was backed up by the arguments that they require maintenance, impede class time, and are costly. My opponent's findings stated that metal detectors can cost between $2,500 and $3,800. While this may seem like a substantial amount of money to many of us college students, compared to a public school's budget, the cost is fairly insignificant. The OC Register reported that a single school district in California had an annual budget of $330 million. Purchasing a few metal detectors and having them kept up is merely pocket change compared to their budget. My opponent's claim that the metal detectors have severe economic consequences is invalid. Her support that metal detectors take away from students' class time was never confirmed or supported. There was no statistical or testimonial statements claiming that metal detectors reduce and/or waste class time. The situation presented is merely a hypothetical one than a factual statement. Her third claim, metal detectors have bad psychological consequences for students, was poorly developed with a lack of sufficient evidence. She supported the claim by saying that interviews with students suggest that metal detectors are associated with a prison-like atmosphere. She used a study that polled students about how metal detectors made them feel, but she didn't say how many students were in the study. There was no background as to how the study was conducted, which school district, and the ages of all the students. Are we supposed to infer that this possible generalization is to apply to all schools with metal detectors? She said that students felt like they're constantly being watched, which made them feel uncomfortable. I feel like this opinion would be better suited for a situation dealing with surveillance cameras rather than metal detectors. There is also a lack of connection between feeling constantly watched because of the metal detectors. She also stated that students were less likely to come to school if they had metal detectors, which led to an inference that they didn't want to come to school because they didn't like the metal detectors, not because they were preventing the kids from things that they would rather be doing. Overall, I felt like my opponent's primary claim that metal detectors in schools have severe negative consequences were not sufficiently backed with her supporting claims. Her first claim, school violence is rather rare, was irrelevant to the primary claim. Her second claim, that metal detectors take away from education, sidesteps some important issues and lacks supporting evidence, while her third claim, that metal detectors have bad psychological consequences, was not supported with enough evidence and led the audience to an unsupported inference.
All right, the background on the subject I thought was fine. There's a good counterclaim that you start up with. You set up what the main proposition and the supporting claims are. You've got a counterclaim presented. Basically, your argument is that there's not sufficient data here. Let's see. I like the fact that you tried at the beginning on the first point to see things in context, talking about how those issues are important and the way in which the metal detectors are being used or the circumstances. I thought that that was a reasonable argument to make. You make a charge about bias on the one source that the advocate used, but just because they have a point of view doesn't mean that they're biased. So I'm not really sure that that's a very legitimate challenge to their evidence there. The rarity issue, I thought you did a pretty good job explaining how important that was. In other words, the different kinds of violence and the usefulness of the metal detectors in those particular contexts. I thought that that was okay. There's, again, a shortage of data on both sides as to whether or not there's any way to measure the effectiveness on this. But the transition to the second point was pretty clear. The cost issue you put into context very easily. I thought you had good data on that. So I don't think that there's too much problem there. The third point, I thought that you summarized what the advocate's claim was pretty well. You argue that there is some problem with the nature of the inferences being drawn there. Those are okay arguments. I think you need to clarify the explanations a little bit. For instance, on the one study that talked about how students wouldn't want to attend a school with metal detectors, I think that there's an implication there that you're hinting at, but you don't quite say. And it's not so much that the metal detectors are what's keeping the kids nervous about the school. It's what kind of school needs to have metal detectors? Do I really want to go to school there? And so there's a causality claim that I think you're hinting at, but it doesn't come across very effectively. The presentation, you do a lot of reading, you just kind of plow through it, there's not much audience contact, and the language sometimes suggests more of an evaluation rather than a refutation of the arguments, although I thought you did a pretty good job evaluating the quality of the reasoning that the advocate used. All right, thanks.